Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Hello, BS listeners, and welcome to this episode as part of the premiere launch of Season 2 of the BS Podcast. And I am very excited to welcome Wendy Wood to the show. Dr. Wendy Wood is Provost Professor of Psychology and Business at the University of Southern California, where she teaches classes on behavior change. Given her research over the past 30 years, she is widely considered the world's scientific expert on habit formation and change. She has published over 100 articles, and her research has been supported by Proctor & Gamble, National Science Foundation, the Templeton Foundation, and the Radcliffe Institute. Wendy is a popular speaker at scientific conferences and with a broad range of professional groups. In 2018, she gave the inaugural address in Paris for the Sorbonne-INSEAD Distinguished Chair in Behavioral Science. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, NPR, Washington Post, on radio shows like Freakonomics, and in podcasts like The People's Pharmacy, as well as now this one. Most recently, Wendy is the author of her new book, Good Habits, Bad Habits. And this is my little side comment, but a rare book as written by an academic and jam-packed with solid science, but accessible to just about anyone who's interested in why humans do the things they do. So, Wendy, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for that lovely introduction.
You're most welcome. And I say we, I speak on behalf of myself, my listeners. We're really excited to have you here in kicking us off for season 2 of the BS podcast. So let's dive right in. Habits. I've followed your research for a long time. I studied rituals as part of my PhD as my defense. So rituals and habits, sister, I guess, behaviors, if you could call it that. So anyways, I've been a fan of your work for a long time. And when I saw the book was coming out, I was really excited. And then I was even more excited when I knew you were coming on the show. So I did a quick Google Trends search to find in the last, I think this was 15 years, whenever Google started tracking that the search keyword habit, the word habit, has increased nearly the frequency of the search about 3 or 4 times. And that just sort of picks up on this theme. Habits, it seems, are sort of all the rage these days, and people are writing, some of these, best-selling books. There's James Clear's Atomic Habits. There's Nir Eya's Hooked, Charles Duhigg's Power of Habit, and of course now yours. And this is all within the last 5 years or so. But before these books come out, were being published, and I'm glad, they are, you were doing this seminal work in, I guess, is it the Psych Bull paper would have been in the late 90s. So before it was fashionable with popular culture, you were doing this work in the science of habit and in the field of social psychology. So I guess my first question for you is why the sudden interest from the general public, at least, in habits? I have my own little pet theory, but I will keep it off for now and listen to you about why do you think that's the case?
Well, I would love to hear your pet theory, so you have to share it after I share mine.
Okay, you have my word.
I think that popular understanding of behavior is evolving along with science. And in the last century, we had B.F. Skinner, and we had Watson, and we had Thorndike, and a bunch of researchers who were arguing that humans have habits that aren't reflected really in conscious experience. But they defined habits so narrowly that then the cognitive revolution came along and argued, no, humans don't just respond in these narrow stimulus response type ways. Instead, people create things and they speak with language and are constantly generating new ideas and new things. And this focus on the conscious experience sort of, it ended up extinguishing any interest in habit in research. But the questions that research needs to address in understanding human behavior continued to evolve, and we continued to reference habit in a variety of different ways. So, cognitive neuroscience has started to identify certain neural systems or patterns that are activated when we repeat behaviors over and over, and that seem to capture habit memory and habit knowledge. Some cognitive experiments, like the old Schifrin and Schneider experiments, actually had a habit component to them. And then, of course, practitioners all over the world have always thought that people respond out of habit. So in consumer behavior, habits have not left us. People continue to think about persistence of human behavior. So I think habits are necessary for understanding human behavior, and we're finally going beyond the restrictions that were put on the field in response to the very extreme definitions of habit that we got in the last century.
I love that. I I love any answer or idea that has a little historical component. And I always find myself walking through, again, like Skinner Watson and the behaviorists, hence the name of my own work, through to the cognitive revolution. And it just sort of puts the pieces together of why we are where we are right now. And I'm glad that my pet theory is quite different than yours. So maybe they can maybe they can complement one each other.
Okay.
The way that I see is, so I think yours takes care of the developments and the changes within the academy and within the research. And as we know, it's sort of like what happens in research then echoes 5 to 15 years later in the general public. So I think that's what's happening now, certainly. But what I'm interested in is why the uptick and why the sudden interest in the general public now. And what I see that was happening at the same time is, digital revolution 2.0 and Silicon Valley of like, 2000s and 2005 and plus, the lean startup method. And with that came this idea within startups and within Silicon Valley of optimizing and the hacking mindset culture. It was almost like this idea that you could run your startups and your businesses as efficiently and in this optimized manner as you could your own mind. So it seems like, and I'll get into this in a second, but it seems like because habits are sort of cognitively cheap, we don't have to spend a whole lot of brain power or energy on executing them and executing those behaviors. And so I think the folks who are in this organizational and workplace space saw habits and were like, I want to hack my behavior and my thinking so that I can do more in a day. And I think it was just sort of the perfect time. So that's my little pet theory. Care to care to poke any holes in it?
No, I wouldn't poke holes in it. I'd add to it. I've always been surprised by how much Silicon Valley understands about people's habits. So, cell phones are the perfect addictive device. We can carry them everywhere with us, and we do. They are unique sources of information, but most of the social media we get on it is not interesting a lot of the time. It gives us information that's really not worth even checking. But every once in a while, we get a nugget of really useful, interesting information from it. And that keeps us checking constantly, because inconsistent rewards, ones that you're not certain you're going to get, are the ones that build habits the fastest. That's what our brain responds to. It's part of that reward prediction error learning that keeps us repeating behavior so that we form habits. And somehow the cell phone has captured that habit formation process really effectively. So I buy your analysis that that modern industry, modern startups are very much aware of this least effort principle
Mm.
and understand much more about habits even than that. I mean, take Amazon, right? That one-click ordering mechanism. They
Mm-hmm.
um, copyrighted that for a while. They had proprietary ownership of it. I think they don't anymore. But they knew that if you make something a little bit more difficult, even 2 clicks, you lose customers. And that's something that we don't think about with our own behavior much, because we assume, well, if I was really interested in buying something, 1 click, 2 click, shouldn't make any difference. But we know it does. And let me give you an example. This is one of my favorite examples. It's not from my own research. A data analytics company followed hundreds of thousands of cell phones for several months, because, of course, our cell phone use is being monitored. They followed how far cell phones, and of course the people holding them, went to a paid fitness center. So how far do you travel to your gym? That's what they were assessing. And what they found is that if cell phones, and the people who are holding them, of course, traveled 3.6 miles to go to a gym, they went 5 times a month on average. But if cell phones traveled 5.1 miles to a gym, they only went once a month on average. Now, to our conscious way of understanding our behavior, that doesn't make any sense, right? If you want to go to the gym, of course you'll go. If you don't want to go, then you won't go. That's what we think is going on. But instead, our behavior is very responsive to friction in the environment around us. And we're likely to repeat behaviors when there's little friction, when it's easy for us to do so. And we tend not to repeat behaviors when it's more difficult. And that is a really important determinant of people's behavior. And that's something that Silicon Valley and cell phone designers and others understand very well.
Mm-hmm.
It's an old principle in marketing. If you're in a grocery store, eye level is buy level.
I like that. I've never heard that. I'm surprised I've never heard that. Now, if you're 6'4" like myself, I'm not sure what's at my eye level, but
then you're buying the cheaper stuff, which they put
yeah, exactly.
at the very high levels or the very low.
Oh,
Yeah.
that explains a lot of my my diet. So I have a few follow-ups. I love this. So first, with the more practical side of say these digital companies and these tech companies that we all know, like the big name ones. Do you, and you said that like the folks in Silicon Valley just have a good understanding of habit and habit related behaviors. It's, I mean, it's no surprise that product designers and these savvy consumer specialists, that they're recognizing the power of habit and they're applying it in very creative ways. And they're, of course, they're commercializing and they're profiting off of their various products and services. And so I guess the point I want to take this to is and to stretch it to this point is do you think for some of those it's at a level of exploitation? Like they know where our weaknesses are because we just have such an innate readiness to engage in habit. Do you think it's, I don't want to use this word, fair or even ethical for them to be designing the products and the services that they are?
That's a great question. I, I, one of the reasons I wrote this book is because I wanted to give people the tools to take back their own decisions about what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. I wanted people to take back control. And part of that is understanding how your behavior works. And because habits, we haven't given a definition of habits yet.
Kind of
but,
scientists are we, right?
Because habits are largely part of the non-conscious, the unconscious. We don't know much about them. You can think of habits as kind of a mental shortcut. So they're mental shortcuts about what to do in a specific context to get a reward. And they're based on what you did in the past to get a reward. So I walk into my kitchen in the morning, I stand in front of the coffee maker, I make coffee just the way I'd done in the past without thinking a whole lot about it, because I know I'm going to get that cup of coffee in the end. That's the reward. And I don't spend any time asking myself, do I want it this morning? Is this something I want to do? Instead, I just do it. Because the environment is cueing me to repeat behavior that I've done in the past. And that's a habit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, trying to think the next direction. Yeah, you know what? I was going to get to this later, but you've mentioned it already that we're uncomfortable with, I guess bringing it back to the history. So in the early part of the 20th century with the behaviorists, it was almost this oversimplistic stimulus reward behavior theme. And then in the cognitive revolution, they said, well, there's more to humans than just that alone. And there's things like, conscious reasoning and verbal fluency and memory and so on and so on. And then the social psychologists that came in and said, oh, we have things like relationships and love and mystery, religion, etc. But there is this point with habits, and I think the point estimate, what is it, 47%? Is that what you found in the research of all our behaviors?
Very close, 43.
43. Yes. So nearly half of all our behaviors are habit based. I wonder if that makes people feel uncomfortable, and I wonder if that was the reason why the cognitive psychologists and the cognitive scientists pushed back against the behaviorists, because they said we humans are more complex than just these sort of automated sequences of stimulus reward. There's much more to us than just than that alone. We're more sophisticated in all our cognitive complexities than the other non-human species. Do you think there's a bit of that, and what comes with that is the challenge to our own personal willpower, if we even have such a thing?
I think you've said it very well. Some of the same biases that we have in our own lives, scientists also take into the lab and appear in theories as well. And one of them, I think, is that we all want to believe that we are actively in control of our behavior all of the time. We don't like our sense of agency to be challenged, and habits challenge that. Because if behavior is automated, then we're not in control of it in quite the same way as we think we are. And some of my current research is trying to understand how people reconcile themselves with their habits. So if you're a habitual coffee drinker, which I am, I keep using that example. If you're a habitual coffee drinker, why do you think you drink coffee? In research we've done, people about equally say, well, it's out of habit as well as because I want that energy boost. I'm feeling tired, I'm flagging. And then if you actually look at their behavior, drinking coffee is not actually something that most people do very regularly in response to feeling tired. Instead, habit is much more important in driving a repeated behavior like that than we give it credit for. So we tend to make our actions seem more deliberate than they actually are. And there's, as we've said, there's good reason why people might have that bias, but it's a bias to overlook, to under-recognize habit and how important it is in our lives, which is kind of interesting to compare to how we started this conversation, which is arguing that tech companies have capitalized on that insight in their own work. Whereas people out there in the real world are busy trying to reinterpret, they're busy actually reinterpreting a lot of their behavior as intended as opposed to habitual.
Mm-hmm. But I guess in a sort of paradoxical or in this ironic way, the more we're aware of it, the more that we are aware of the inevitable and necessary fact that much of our behavior is driven by habits. As you said in the sort of the point of the book is the more we can recognize when our habits are doing a service and when they are not. So good habits, bad habits. Because if we're convinced and we're going to undergo some sort of post hoc rationalization that I acted the way I did because I intended to, because I willed it, when in fact that's not the case. We're deceiving ourselves. So recognizing and reading books like yours and others is I remember George Miller said it's giving psychology away. It's recognizing that we have all these insights from the science and we can put it in a popular book format and teach people about themselves so that they can make more informed, better decisions. Yeah?
Exactly. So if you don't recognize the habitual nature of your behavior, then it's easy to fail when you try to change it. Because if your behavior is really due to your intentions, right, to what you've decided, then you have to change those. But if your behavior is due more to the circumstances you're in and how you habitually respond to them, then you take a very different approach. And let me illustrate those two, because this is another historical example. One of the best demonstrations of habit change, I think, in the public health domain is with smoking. So in the 1950s and 60s, we became very much aware as a country that smoking caused cancer. But people continued to smoke up until, even after that Surgeon General's report, Reader's Digest had a big article, and everyone was reading Reader's Digest back in the last century, about cancer by the carton. People started to understand that smoking was really bad for them, but few people quit until we got taxes on cigarettes, making them more difficult to buy. until we had bans in public places that made it more difficult for people to smoke on a regular basis. And we took cigarettes off of the store shelves, so you actually have to go ask someone to buy a pack of cigarettes. All of those things add friction, make the behavior slightly more difficult. And in doing that, they discouraged people from smoking to the point that now only 15% of us on average smoke, whereas in the last century it was as much as 50%. So that's a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
And if you thought that people were smoking because they wanted to, then you'd educate them. But that didn't work. Instead, if you think people are smoking because they have a habit to smoke, and nicotine is addictive, then you would do other things. You'd make the behavior more difficult. And that, in fact, worked.
Mm-hmm. In ways, it's kind of freeing, right? It's kind of it I don't, and maybe this is an individual differences thing where for me, I kind of, that makes me feel better about it. I don't feel like there's a loss of control when I own up to the fact that most of my, or a lot of my behaviors are driven by habit. It's almost like if I am struggling with some part of my life, then I can look at it and I can look at myself and I'm not going to say, I'm not going to blame me. I'm not going to
Mhm.
blame my failures or my failings of self-control. I'm not going to blame my own disposition or my own personality, and instead I'm going to look to the sort of the external surroundings of my environment or my situation and say maybe it's more to do with that. And then again, in this sort of ironic way, it brings back that sense of control, because then we can apply those constraints to the situation to optimize our behavior. Is that the way it's sort of recognizing it?
Exactly. I think it does lead to a kind of self-forgiveness that you realize that
Mm-hmm.
it's not your personal failing that you can't change unwanted behaviors. I mean, so many of us want to lose weight, we want to exercise more, we want to save more money. And the idea that we would think it's our own personal failure that we're not doing these things is kind of silly when you look at the data. Right?
Mm-hmm.
60% of us are overweight or obese. At this point, most people, when they head towards retirement, don't really have enough money to support themselves. So once you start realizing that these are shared problems that come from the context, the environments in which we live, they're not your personal failings, I do think it's easier to deal with.
Interesting. And it also brings in, and this is now totally off the cuff, this is a totally half-baked idea. So we'll see how this goes.
Some of
um
the best comments
there you
are
go.
off the cuff.
There
Yes.
you go. Because I get into these conversations and these debates with family and friends often, where we talk about just different stratifications of folks in society. So your low, medium, and high SES. And we, as lay psychologists, we always go around and we want to try and make sense of why an individual is in their life situation that they're in. Is it because they made bad decisions from the very beginning? And so there's some culpability there. There's some, they have to take some personal responsibility because they're an individual and they made shitty decision after shitty decision. Or is there a little bit more, I guess understanding and even a sense of compassion, which says maybe that person is in that bad way and is in a tough situation because of the environment that they were raised, because of the external pressures that they faced growing up in the neighborhood that they grew up in. And it's almost like that latter explanation fits more with the data than the former one.
Yeah. I mean, I would certainly advocate compassion with either explanation, and it is possible with either explanation. I think what's important for people to hear is that regardless of which is true, that there is a way out. And regardless of whether it is your environment that is maintaining your behavior right now, or some bad decisions you made early on that's maintaining an unwanted behavior, still, there are ways to alter the context that you're living in, the environments you're living in, so that other behaviors become easier. I think there's a fallacy that many of us fall into, looking at really successful people and assuming that they must be doing something different. They must know something. They must have super willpower. They must have been prescient and made all the right decisions early on. They did something that's different from me, from my experience. And what research is showing is that even scales that measure willpower and identify people who have really high willpower and are the kind who succeed, because we know this from psychology, years of psychological research, that some people do score higher in willpower than others. And those people who score high in willpower just generally have better life outcomes. They have better relationships with their spouses. They don't go into debt the way other people do. They pay their credit cards on time. They get better grades in school. They make higher salaries. They weigh less. I mean, it's like a magic ingredient for everything that you want to achieve in life. It starts to look like self-control is the answer. Except that recent studies, and again, these are not studies in my lab, have suggested that self-control is actually related to habit. That people who score high on self-control scales know how to form habits that are beneficial to them. So the reason why they weigh less is because they have habitually a healthy diet, and they do it automatically. They eat healthy automatically without being tempted by other kinds of things, because that's what habits do for you, is they narrow your decision-making sphere. So you're focused on what you've done before, and you're not tempted by other things that might not be good for you or might not meet your goals right now. So that's something that people with high self-control, we've learned, do, is they meet their goals by forming beneficial habits. And this makes sense given what we know about successful writers. I was just down in, before all of this virus craziness started, I was in Florida in the Keys. I went to Ernest Hemingway's house, and he had a big studio set up for his writing every morning. That's standard for writers. They have habits for how much they write each day, where they write, when they write, and they tend to do it without questioning a lot of, should I be writing today? Of course, sometimes the writing goes badly, right? For all of us, we all get writer's block at times, but they have habits that make it easier for them to do it on a regular basis and turn out large amounts of work regularly. And that serves them well. It serves people well in other parts of their lives as well, if you can figure out how to organize your environment to make it easier for you to meet your goals.
Mm-hmm. So let's just maybe take a few steps back, because this is actually how you open up the book. you sort of talk about this example with a family member and with weight loss and weight control. And through that story, you end up making the argument, or the what we know from research is that we're not a single unified self, willing certain decisions. We are of multiple minds or multiple selves. And you could say there's at least two selves. There's the, if we're speaking prospect theory language, there's system one, system two. There's on the one hand, the more, I guess I'm reversing them now, system two, where on the one hand, there's the more deliberate, the conscious executive control, self-control, where there's this deliberate, effortful weighing of costs and benefits, et cetera, et cetera. And it's effortful, it's resource intensive, it's tough. And then there's the other system one, which is more automated and habit driven. So here, what I'm trying to understand, and what you've said, is that it's not as much about self-control as much as it is in terms of predicting these really important life outcomes, as it is this sort of setting up of habits. So I guess my question is how do you see the distinction between those two selves? And I realize they're not mutually exclusive and there is some overlap there, but in what way do we sort of toggle on and off between those two states? If you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good way of describing it. We do toggle on and off between them. And we all experience that when we're driving, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're there driving, and then you're not, and then you're back when something unusual happens. So there is this constant interaction between our habitual selves and our more thoughtful, deliberate selves. But your experience of yourself is very much more driven by the conscious piece than by the non-conscious one. We don't have access to it, so we can only sort of observe what it's doing, which is like in that driving experience. In fact, I have always said I'm a much better habitual driver than I am a thoughtful driver, because my thoughtful driving is likely to overreact, whereas my habitual driving has been carefully developed through much repetition. So I think I'm much safer as a habitual driver than a more thoughtful one. But you can't always go on habit, because sometimes unusual things happen on the road and you have to respond immediately.
Well, that's why I like this is sort of one of my favorite ways to think about that distinction, is that we engage in habit behaviors so that we have enough left over to respond in those moments when we need, the deliberate, effortful thinking and decision making, right?
Yeah. So going back to your example with tech companies, they want efficiency so that they can innovate, because both are needed, right? You can only put effort into so much. And we're actually doing studies in the lab right now where we have people form habits for how to approach problems. And we show that if they have a habitual way of approaching a problem, they are able to be more creative in solving it. And that work is interesting, I think, because most of us consider habits to be sort of the opposite of creativity. But in fact, if you know how to approach a problem, then you're not wasting your time trying to figure out which piece should I do now? Should I go back and work on something else instead? You're focused. And you're focused on what is important in the problem, which helps you then be creative and come up with better solutions in the end. And that's, in a sense, what a good, nimble, yet stable company does. An organization that has both this ability to repeat good past practices as well as innovate is in a good economic situation.
Mm-hmm. And I guess continuing in that vein with organizational and workplace life. Let's say you were designing your ideal organization. What would you see as the best leadership style and the best sort of way to set up the organizational structure in terms of these things like reward delivery and feedback and reinforcement, so that you could cultivate the ideal or the best habit-based behaviors out of your team? And do you think managers and business leaders are thinking about this, assuming they haven't read your book yet?
I well, I do think there has been some work on this. So Toyota for a while had this policy in their assembly lines that workers were supposed to question the assembly line procedures. And actually, we're supposed to pull or push a button, pull a cord to disrupt the line at times. They were supposed to do that because Toyota saw benefit in both stable procedures that work and are efficient, as well as continually modifying those as people come up with new ways of doing things, more efficient ways, as they're faced with new challenges from new designs. So organizations that are effective are doing both. The question of how to do both is one that I think varies from organization to organization. But there's some organizational theorists who argue that maybe you need people, a particular unit that is tasked with capturing best practices and repeating them, and another unit that's tasked with innovating as markets change, as consumer preferences change, and then a very strong leader above both to integrate those two units. It's not what Toyota did, because Toyota had both the procedural repetition as well as the change and disruption in the same position. But sometimes you may need to separate them so that both can function effectively.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like that org structure it mirrors the in some ways the human brain. You know, you have the two systems, and then you have your big leader at the top, the executive function individual or in set of individuals who are then integrating and making those decisions. That's a really interesting analogy. I've never heard of that, but I will find that and put it in the show notes for listeners.
Very cool.
Couple more questions, Wendy, if you don't mind.
Of course.
One quick one, because I have to. This is one of my favorite studies of yours, of and yours and your colleagues, the popcorn study with the fresh versus stale. Would you mind walking listeners through that briefly, just to see what you found?
Of course. So the question we were dealing with here is, how do habits work with current rewards? So habits are supposed to be cued by the context around us, which means that they're caused by what happens before we do something, and what happens afterwards should become then less important. So we set out to test this idea. It's a very abstract explanation, but It'll become clear in a minute. So we set out to test this idea in a local movie theater. What we did is we showed people movie trailers and we gave them boxes of popcorn, supposedly as a way of saying thank you for them rating these movie trailers for us. And some participants got a box of stale popcorn, and this was very stale. It had sat in our lab room in a plastic bag for a week. So it was not something most of us would eat. And the second, so half got stale popcorn, half got a box of fresh popcorn. What we were really interested in is whether people would eat the popcorn. And we had them report on whether they typically ate popcorn in the movie cinema, and that was our measure of habit. And what we found is that people who typically eat popcorn in the movie cinema, they ate the fresh popcorn, they ate the stale popcorn. They could tell us that they hated the stale popcorn, but they ate it anyway. People who didn't have habits, they acted the way most of us think we would, which is they ate the fresh popcorn and didn't eat the stale. What's really interesting is that we also studied people outside of the movie theater, and then it didn't matter what their habits were. We tested them in a lab room on campus. They were watching music videos. It was darkened, but no one had a habit to eat popcorn in that setting. And in that setting, everybody avoided the stale popcorn. They ate the fresh popcorn. It didn't matter what their popcorn eating habits in the cinema were. So what this study shows is that once we've formed habits, we keep repeating them, even when they're not ideal and they're not really working for us anymore. And that suggests that habits indeed are caused by the context that we're in, and they're not forward-looking to the outcome of that response. Instead, they're very backward-looking.
Great. And my final question, the BBB, or the Big Behavioral Brainstorm, which I ask all guests who come on the show, of all the problems we're faced now these days, which one, and it can be habit related or not, your answer, I mean, which one could stand to benefit from a psychological or a behavioral type intervention?
Well, it's hard not to think about the current virus threat at this point. We know that so much of the contagion depends on human behavior. It depends on whether we wear masks, whether we stay 6 feet away from each other, whether we wash our hands. All of those can become habits easily if we practice them. So this contagion could be controlled, at least mitigated to a great extent through people's habits. But it's hard to think of any social problem right now that's not in some way linked to our habits. I think once the virus threat passes, as we all hope it will at some point soon, that we're going to be back worrying about the environment, and many people haven't stopped, thank heaven. And that's definitely a human behavior problem. It's our environmental policies right now at the government level don't help people reduce their carbon footprint. They don't help people recycle, stop using single-use plastics. All of those things are very difficult in current circumstances we live. Many people, I live in LA, many people drive much more than they should. Those are all habits. They're things we do automatically without questioning them. And it's one of the things that makes it so difficult to change environmental policy is that people are doing things that are not environmentally sensitive. One of the good news pieces of information here is that often after policymakers change environmental policies, people start to like the new behavior. And it's interesting. Support for congestion pricing, for example, in driving. There's good evidence that drivers benefit, and they realize they benefit from congestion pricing. And support for those kinds of policies increases after they're implemented. There's good evidence that support for plastic bag tax, so that you have to pay to get a plastic bag when you go to the store, that consumers very often increase their support for those after they're implemented. So once we make policies that encourage environmentally conscious actions, consumers, the general public, often comes around because we easily adopt new habits for these sorts of things when enough friction is put on our behavior and we realize the benefits. And then we form habits to do those things over and over that now we're allowed to do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting how that works.
Mm-hmm. Well, if anyone's listening out there, and there are, you know what, I think that the lesson in all that is that policymakers, managers, business leaders, product designers, just about anyone, and including just your average person, your average citizen, would stand to learn about habits generally, and by extension, their own personal habits, both good and bad. And I think, you know, as you said a few minutes ago or halfway through our conversation, is that the purpose of the book was to bring back, you know, not bring back, but to bring some control to people and to people's lives so that they can understand what drives their behavior and why. And I think for that reason, it's very, very powerful. It's a tremendous book, and I recommend everyone who's listening go and buy it and read it. It's you know, I come from academia, and a lot of scientists and social psychologists in particular are quite terrible at discussing and summarizing research findings in a very accessible and easily digestible way. Yours is not that, Wendy. It's quite a pleasure to read. So kudos and congratulations on the book. And thank you for coming on the show. This was a lot of fun.
It's my pleasure. Great talking with you.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, Keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.